Hi, everyone. Welcome to BGC. My name is Emma Cormack. I'm an associate curator here at Bard Graduate Center Gallery. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest, Emily Adams Bode Aujla, who was the first female designer to show at New York Fashion Week Men's. She's paving the way for women entrepreneurs in the menswear industry. In 2016, she launched her brand with a collection of one-of-a-kind garments composed entirely of antique textiles. She continues to reinvigorate American menswear through the art of storytelling and preservation with these foundational one-of-a-kind pieces alongside collections of historical reproductions. Bode has been recognized with numerous awards, including both the 2022 and 2021 CFDA Menswear Designer of the Year, 2020 Woolmark Prize Karl Lagerfeld Award, the 2019 LVMH Prize finalist, 2019 CFDA Emerging Designer of the Year, 2019 Business of Fashion 500, 2019 GQ's Breakthrough Designer of the Year, and Forbes 30 Under 30. So with that, I'll pass it over to Emily, and we'll have a presentation and then a short question and answer session with Michele and myself, and questions from the audience, and then a special surprise at the end. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here and honored to speak to you all today, especially after seeing such a fantastic exhibit. And if you guys haven't gone, make sure you go. So I feel like it's, I'm going to talk about lace like a bit, but I also feel like it's good to give context to how Bode as a business and how our team has created a company in which we really are dedicated to the idea of reuse and of incorporating historical techniques like lace into collections so that we have, we raise a bigger awareness for antique materials and the importance of preservation. So I'll just start. Yeah, cool. So I started the brand in 2016 after I went to Parsons for philosophy and menswear design. I studied, I did 2 degrees, mostly because I had always wanted to major in something that I felt could further my knowledge and really share context to why I do what I do. So I've always been really interested in the narrative behind things and people's personal histories and intimate relationships to their domestic space and to textiles in general and material culture in general. So my joint degree really led me to launch a company that had a really intimate kind of narrative around materials and how we can really change consumer culture. So when I launched, like you heard, it was primarily made from antique textiles, and I had about 1 garment that was a reproduction of an antique quilt, but for the most part, the foundation of the brand is made from domestic cloth, so everything from lace tablecloths to bedding to pillow shams and quilts, as well as you can see here are coverlets, and to the right, it's a quilt that's a reproduction. The one-of-a-kind aspect of our business is really, quite a feat in the fashion industry. We have dedicated ourselves to employing many people within our own studio so that we are able to scale our atelier as the rest of our business scales. So when I first started the brand, it was really hard for people who had existed and thrived in the fashion industry to really understand how we could create a scalable business here and how it could be something other than what could be just a craft project or just like, an after college project. So it's been the last 6.5, almost 7 years of really dedicating ourselves to that growth and taking something like an almost homemade domestic craft and revitalizing an entire industry around it. So I feel like through our one-of-a-kind aspect of the brand, we've really been able to change the way in which people look at their own materials in their homes, in their grandparents' homes, in their family homes, and allow people to have a context for those materials. So we tell the narrative of, you know, specific types of lace, or specific type, like historical techniques like embroideries, and what is different between a hand embroidery and a machine embroidery. And all of this information, we really try to share that knowledge both on our, you know, our social media platforms, but also within our assets. So every time you buy a shirt, or if you look at a shirt and there's a hang tag that tells how many of this one thing that or how many of something was made, but also that this one tablecloth might have had a really interesting provenance, you know, from a farmhouse or something like that. So it's really important for us to continue to share that knowledge, even as the business, you know, hits closer to being, I guess, like a mid-sized business, larger scale business. Here are some examples of some of the domestic cloth, specifically in the lace category, that we use quite a bit. It's interesting because when I first started the brand and started making clothing out of antique materials, it was easy, I guess, to let me start. So it was not easier to find, but there was like this true understanding of how this one thing could yield this, and how we could have this employee cut this. And as we've scaled the business, the importance of hand cutting has really taken shape, and how to even quantify that scalability is really fascinating. So if you think about it, most of the domestic cloth that we use truly only yields one item, which allows our clients to, you know, have something that is truly one of a kind. So these are, you know, we use both bedspreads and tablecloths made from lace. One of our most popular styles are shirts made from Quaker lace, and Quaker lace has such a wonderful history. But when we work with something like Quaker lace, it's such a, you know, it's a really labor intensive process, from mending, sorting, you know, both rotten cloth and cloth that can be used and worn and loved. We have to make, instead of doing something traditional like buttonholes, the studio has crafted loops so that we're really paying homage to the cloth itself, and, you know, showing sometimes there's like a beautiful scallop edge stitching that we can highlight. Here's some more examples of some of our one-of-a-kind lace pieces, both over-dyed lace, something like a novelty mid-century crochet lace in the center that is, you can see how important the placement of cutting something like this is by hand. The mending of some of this cloth is, you know, it might take hours and days of one studio employee just to bring it up to the place in which we want to, you know, have a more of a luxury garment. Here's another example of a crochet lace that's more, you know, it's quite delicate, versus this next slide. You can see, you know, more of like a heavy crochet that we've over-dyed in the center, and it's flanked by two filet lace examples. Here's a close-up of, there's like a natural crochet with fringe in the center, and then two of our over-dyed lace. Lastly, this is a one-of-a-kind piece that it's just like you know, a more interesting kind of example of lace. It's like netting with embroidery, and you can see it's quite feminine. I think that one of the reasons that something like lace has stuck out for us as a brand is because we are traditionally a menswear brand. You know, we show on the menswear calendar, but we offer so many garments that are made from textiles that were largely made by and for women or for the home. So it's definitely kind of changing the traditional menswear sphere in the New York luxury space. So I wanted to highlight a couple other, or I guess one specific technique that we do in our business, and this is aiding in the preservation of a historical narrative. So it's not taking something like an antique material and giving it new life. It's more so taking an entire history and tradition that Americans had, and then allowing other people to partake in this as an activity and as something that they can too pass on for generations. So this is our senior cord collection, and we offer it. It's like a seasonless part of our business. We offer trousers and jackets and bags, baby jackets, pillows. The tradition originated at Purdue University, which you can see, this is a picture from their archives, from the university archives, in around 1900, and kind of faded out largely in the 70s. You can still find a couple pieces, maybe from the 80s or 90s, but its heyday was the 40s and 50s. Students would decorate their corn-colored corduroy, and the oral history behind the corn-colored corduroy is that it was actually just on sale, and so that's what drew college students to purchase it. It was the only thing on sale in the fabric store. So this evolved into this really wild history. So we now offer it through an interview process for people to, put everything from their favorite car or their favorite restaurant, album covers that meant a lot to them, to, important family histories of dates and baby names and things like that. So from our second kind of, bucket of our business, we have our one of a kind, and then we also have our collections. So our collections really aid in storytelling on a much larger scale. We focus on personal histories, really intimate personal histories of individuals, to raise awareness of historical techniques, but also of what brought that individual to be who they are today. So it might be, an art gallerist who his understanding of what it meant to collect things, or his understanding of really specific ephemera led him to be the collector or art gallerist he is today. So we make our collections in New York, but also in Peru and India, in Portugal and Italy. We have hand-woven textiles also from the UK that we work with. A lot of our laces and crochets are Peru and India, with a bit of it coming from France for this new collection. So this idea of preservation is a little bit different because, like I said, it's not cutting or utilizing an antique material and telling the history of that antique material. Instead, it's taking something like a window valance and reimagining it as a shirt. So a lot of these techniques are not often practiced in our factories. So it has taken a lot of time and energy to allow us to, try out new techniques that may or may not be the same way in which some of these historical textiles were made. Here's an image of two of our crochet lace workers in Peru. This was, a mid-century tablecloth that we reproduced for men's vests and long sleeve shirts. Here's another example of a crochet lace. It's much heavier. This is entirely made by hand, versus this is like a machine-made lace in a much lighter fabric. Here's another machine-made lace. This is it's a little bit more geometric, and it's like a woven netting. Here's an example of some popular collection styles that we offer in addition to our one-of-a-kind lace pieces. These have the ability, we do have, branding on them. We can do short sleeve and long sleeve. They're all still cut by hand, but it's definitely, one of a few versus one of a kind. One of my favorite styles, which I brought here today, is this reproduction of a ribbon work shirt. So the original piece of this was actually like quite small. So much of the collection is inspired by pieces that you could not necessarily wear now. So we have to reimagine them in textiles that offer wearability and for contemporary sizing today. So this is an example of a shirt. I mean, this shirt takes, I think it's like over 40 days to make less than 30 shirts. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of hours of work to make this shirt. And feel free to touch it. It's entirely done by hand, and you can see that the ribbon is threaded by hand to create that lace design. Lastly, I wanted to talk to you guys a bit about the way in which we've incorporated the narrative of the brand through our retail environments and through our community. Our stores and our tailor shop are designed by Green River Project, and they really highlight this understanding of community and of the intention behind craft and of the interior space and domestic space. This is our store on Hester Street. Our tailor shop has been incredibly important to our, both our growth and sharing the ethos of our business. We are able to preserve antique materials and people's heirlooms within our tailor shop, but also offer simple alterations and repairs, for like your denim or your mother's quilt or things like that. We specialize in the repair of antique clothing as well. So it's become a place that services our community, like the coffee shop that existed there before, to allow people to have a longer lifetime of their own clothing. Here's a couple interior shots of our tailor shop. Our most recent store that we opened is in Los Angeles, also designed by Green River Project, and this store has an emphasis on the idea of education as preservation and the emphasis on conservation. So the store itself is designed as a space almost akin to a museum, and it tells the narrative of something like the rise and fall of our, the dodo bird. You can see a skeleton up there, but also of our relationship to natural history and to the natural world, and how remembrance and education and sharing these stories, even tragic ones like the dodo bird, are incredibly important to our society and our understanding of our own life. So I brought a couple of things here that really highlight how we take something like a domestic cloth. There's a flower pot crochet table. It's like a dresser scarf, and how we've reimagined it in a historical reproduction for our collections. Here on this shirt, the Valance shirt that I showed you a picture of the Valance itself, and then of the lookbook image, is here over top a 1920s lame dress. And then, of course, the threadwork shirt. There's a few other little things on the table that I'd love for you guys to come see. Everything from a handmade lace to a machine-made lace, lace made by, markets from other markets that weren't intended to be sold in the market in which it was made. You have antique Turkish beaded trim. There's also a little salesman sample from my private collection of a bra. So this was something you like a salesman would take it around, and it would show, instead of carrying, hundreds of adult size bras around, you'd take like a miniature version of it, to show how the construction of that piece was. One of the most special things in our collection, it's a pair of shoes, and it's possibly a bridal set of a vegetable crochet lace pair of shoes and purse, possibly made in China. and there's about 2 other versions of this known, but they're incredibly beautiful and incredibly light and have taken, it's so labor intensive. So all of that is available for you to see up here. Anyway, thank you.
So thank you so much. That was wonderful. I wonder if you, because you're so interested in keeping track of and recording the stories of these objects before they come to you and are made into garments, I wonder how you go about recording their lives after they leave your store or your website. Do you have feedback from your clients, or do you keep track of them after they leave your walls?
Well, it's a great question. It's actually, that process has changed quite a bit over the years. So when I first started the brand, we were handwriting numbers and keeping like an Excel doc of every garment. If I knew the history of the garment or the provenance of the textile, then I would write it, and then that number would correlate to the garment that we sold. So the tag had a space where we could write the number. We then partnered a few years later with Microsoft to build a quilt AI, to be able to track the quilt patterns throughout history and within our own garments, so that you could ostensibly take a picture of one of our quilt jackets and it would bring up this program. So that we've done a couple of different methods to tracking and archiving the narratives of each individual garment. We work with 2 people in our studio to write the copy on the hang tags. So that's something that is forever stored, and it goes with the garment so that somebody can then reference that history on the hang tag. It reads almost like a wine label. But in terms of archiving the image of everything, I'd say, we take pictures of maybe like 80% of what we make. And then there's a few things that are not photographed. So it's definitely something that we're really able to pivot on. And I foresee us changing our process around that in the future.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Emily. I'm wondering whether you could tell us, maybe sort of take us through the process of thinking through a collection, how you start thinking about that, through to the runway debut. And, having seen your vast inventory yesterday, I'm wondering, do you look at certain textiles that inspire you as you walk through, or how are you sort of thinking about each collection, and what how much is sort of sourcing and design and testing and marketing? So if you could.
Yeah, so each collection begins with a historical narrative of, like I said, like a particular person. So I've done collections on family members, of friends, of my husband, and their family histories. I think it's a little bit of both. Sometimes I'll source a fabric that I know that I want to save for a specific collection. And other times it would be, okay, so we're doing a collection on my uncle and his relationship to the grenier, or the attic in which he lived in the south of France in his mother's house. So then we would counter source French textiles and French techniques to go alongside that collection. But as you saw yesterday, I mean, we have quite an extensive archive at this point, being almost 7 years old, and I save everything. So, so we have tons of antique clothing, vintage textiles, and we've recently hired Adam, who's here today, as our archivist, our in-house archivist. So we're getting quite organized, so that I started pulling for a new collection today. And I know exactly, these are all the knit bins, and it's 1930s knits, and how, we can get really particular in almost sourcing in our own studio for specific collections.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. And thank you for showing us all the lace examples in your past collections. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this idea of men wearing lace. It's sort of a hot topic these days, although, of course, men have worn lace throughout history. Since it is a menswear line, do you see in your clientele, is it mostly men buying lace, or do you see a wider group?
Yeah, I'd say so. What I've heard is in any given menswear company, it typically is 50% men and women, or 50% women, 50% men shopping. And that's, even at like a Brooks Brothers. But I think what sets us apart is that half of our clients are men and women. So I think what sets us apart is that women are also shopping for themselves, whereas at something like a Brooks Brothers, they're shopping for, their husband, spouses, gifts, whatever. I have seen, from a more personal perspective of our own clients, a change in the wearing of lace. When I first started, it was really a certain clientele that was buying it, or they're buying it more as like some of the heavier crochet lace as overshirts. And I guess throughout the last like 5 years, it's really shifted to we have more and more clients who are buying lace who otherwise, a couple of years ago would never have even looked at something like that to buy. And, I think that's also, it's a resurgence in individuality and we see lace on a lot of icons in fashion and in pop culture. So I think it's just allowed people to understand also from seeing it on other people to how they could wear it. Yeah.
I have a question that comes out of working for a dealer. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with dealers, how that's changed or not over, since you started. And also, again, having, working for a dealer, how do you make the decision about what should be cut up and what shouldn't?
So, okay. So I have some dealers to answer your last question first, I have some dealers who actually are really particular about what they believe should be cut and not cut. And to me, it's really important. If somebody has taken the time and energy to save and preserve this antique textile, that as the second or, maybe 100th owner, that I take that into consideration. So we have a lot of textiles that I've inherited from dealers in the past that are meant only for inspiration or, to eventually donate one day. But we use textiles as, as I kind of mentioned, not just for reuse. So we have quite an extensive archive of textiles that are only intended to engage with our own employees and our team on some of these techniques, but also as inspiration for individual collections. So it comes down to, a couple of different factors. Sometimes it's how pristine the textile is, or the technique, if it's rare, or if it's something that has like a really specific provenance to it. Maybe it was photographed in this, or it was in an exhibit, or it's photographed for a book, or then we take the time to really make a decision based on what to cut and what not to cut.
Great, thank you. I wonder too, we had the pleasure of visiting you yesterday and speaking with Adam about the emerging archive. I wonder if you could talk about this process of archiving while you're expanding and archiving both the objects in your collection that you use as inspiration and also your own company archive.
Yeah, I think we hadn't had the ability to invest in, having a team member like Adam until really recently. So that's definitely a new process for us. It was more important to just begin the act of like saving things and putting them somewhere, even if we weren't necessarily taking all the steps to have all of the information down. But I think in any business, it's so important to to archive your process and your practice, and all the past people who have worked at the company and all the materials that we've used, so that we can always look back on that.
Great, thank you. Okay, now it's time for questions from the audience. I'm sure there are lots. I'm going to start with Elena.
I'll just give you mine. Oh, sorry. I just jumped up the front. Sorry. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And thank you for sharing. And I was eager to ask, as a lace maker, it's been so wonderful over the last few years to see the increasing visibility of handmade textiles like lace in fashion, and seeing designers like Dior and Fendi and indie designers working with lace makers that work by hand, because it's been a flagging industry for decades, centuries even. And I also really appreciated how much you are focused on narrative and stories and telling people stories. So I was curious. I think one of the things that sets lacemaking apart today in fashion is that there's a new focus and visibility of the makers themselves, and that they're not just hidden away in basements anymore. And they, have been highlighted by different brands. So I was curious I love seeing your Peruvian crochet lace makers, was amazing. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about sort of the maker stories behind your reproduction line, and if that's, important to you to share.
Yeah, it's definitely really important. I mean, I know I keep coming back to this, the hang tag, but on the hang tag, we really emphasize the place in which we made the end garment. So offering that transparency, I believe, is not only ethical, but it's also allows for people to really engage with the product and feel like they too are part of the life cycle of the product, and to extend the life cycle of the product. So it's almost this idea that if you have, just a bit more knowledge of where something is coming from, that you then will aid in having it for longer, or take care of it a little bit more. On on our makers and our factories, we tend to work with family owned and operated factories, as well as like female entrepreneurs. So some of the knitters and crochet communities are actually female collectives that have formed to not just provide, to be self-sufficient and, have an income, but also to further these techniques that have really, as you mentioned, were on the decline for so many years.
Thank you. Kate?
Thank you. Emily, that was wonderful, so inspiring, beautiful. So I wonder, do you worry about the supply of materials, not so much for sourcing, but more about once it's in your hands, it's part of a commercial system? And how does that look as you scale? Because it's a finite resource. I'm talking about the historical textiles.
So, yes, this is definitely like a question we get often. What's happening is our product changes. So it's not that we're always making something like clothing out of Quaker lace, for example. It might shift, something like a 1970s lace curtains, or might become more appealing to us in future collections. So the dead stock and vintage textiles in which we're making clothing isn't, there's a through line to it, but it's not necessarily the same materials every season. So in that way, the limit is not so overbearing. I do often, say, for any given household, you could go into their home and open their linen closets, and there's like hundreds and hundreds of linens or textiles to some extent. I think that the contemporary way in which people live, it's definitely less than probably it was like 50 years ago. We don't really have like trousseaux and trunks and things of our bedding, and table linens, and the way that we host people is very different. It looks very different today than it did 50 years ago. But there is also not a specific region that we're looking at. Most of our textiles do come from the US, but we buy quite a lot of linen and lace from the UK and from France. So and a lot of textiles from India. So the region is so expansive that we're not necessarily limited by supply at this point.
Great. Other questions? Yes. Yeah. It's fine.
I love your work. Thank you for sharing it. I've been personally very interested lately in the idea of the original, in quotes. I come from the fine arts world, so not decorative arts. And your entire philosophy and everything you do is based on the value of something being original, which I personally grew up with and believe in. But I understand that it's a societal construct. And I see with younger generations that the idea of the original seems to matter less and less. So someone is just as happy with a reproduction of a 1950s chair as they are with, quote unquote, the original. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that works and how you've encountered it, and do you feel your ideas are so wonderful? Do you feel that this can penetrate a younger generation and be valuable to them when they've grown up looking at reproductions only of paintings of everything?
Yeah, that's a great question. One way that we talk about our own reproductions versus our one of a kind is that with a one of a kind piece, we can tell that narrative once. And maybe if that garment is sold again on a secondary market or something, that narrative could potentially be told again, or on a social media post or something like that. But really, the reach of that individual garment is quite small, although perhaps it's more important. It's hard to say because the reach of a historical reproduction of, of a shirt like the shirt behind me, the reach is so much greater because we are including that in our collections, and we're able to tell that story as many times or more of that the garment is made. So if it's 100 times or something, that story, not everybody, of course, reads about what they're buying, but the hope is that we're aiding in preservation to a much larger degree. And I think in the case of something like you said, like a chair being reproduced, I think the end goal for Bode or it almost doesn't matter because it matters in that I feel like I'm a collector and I enjoy collecting these antique pieces and I enjoy, like you said, the original. But it's really what matters to me is that you're changing the culture in which people dress and the way people shop and the way they decorate their homes, and that there's an intention behind it. So it's creating a community and a society of like hyper intentional people. So when you take something like a reproduction of a chair, it still has the history of the original designer there. Unless it's a complete knockoff or something, but I think it's almost equally as important. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Julie.
Thank you. Thanks for this. This is really interesting. I really appreciate your attention to techniques of making, in addition to just like the materials that you're working with. And I was just wondering if when you find some of these antique fabrics, if you are seeing techniques that you don't know how to do yet, and how you go about figuring out, right, how that piece of lace or embroidered like vintage thing is made. Yeah.
So, okay. So a perfect example of this actually is we just released our new collection, which visits a lot of the pieces that I had originally made as one of a kind my first year in business, because I didn't feel like we could properly reproduce them. and some of our factories at that point had tried, but I didn't feel like they could reproduce them honoring the original textile. So we held off for almost like 5 or 6 years for the reproduction. So I think, to answer your question, I mean, we are really all about slow growth and taking our time to perfect something. So we won't put something out in the market that we don't feel properly either reinvigorates that technique or that narrative. Sometimes, though, we're not necessarily reproducing the technique as a one-to-one, but we're reproducing the idea of the technique. So we could take something like, a machine-made lace, but actually reimagine it as an embroidery, but still talk about how that pattern of that Quaker lace was really instrumental in, home decor, and how that pattern like existed in the White House, and that's where it got its name, something like that. So I think there's a couple of different components to your question.
Thank you very much. All right, so just to make sure we have enough time to see these objects that you brought to share with us, with that, that's the end of our Q&A. So I guess I'll invite you to come up and look, right? Yes. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.